Alright guys, so let's continue on chapter 5 of Tortilla Flat. How St. Francis turned the tide and put a gentle punishment on Pilon and Pablo and Jesus Maria. Chapter 5. The afternoon came down as imperceptibly as age comes to a happy man. A little gold entered into the sunlight. The bay became bluer and dimpled with shore wind ripples. Those lonely fishermen who believed that the fish bite at high tide left their rocks and their places were taken by others who were convinced that the fish bite at low tide. At 3 o'clock, the wind veered around and blew softly in from the bay, bringing all manner of fine kelp odors. The menders of nets in the vacant lots of Monterey put down their spindles and rolled cigarettes. Through the streets of the town, fat ladies in whose eyes lay the weariness and the wisdom one sees so often in the eyes of pigs were trundled in overpowered motor cars toward tea and gin fizzes at the Hotel Del Monte. On Alvarado Street, Hugo Machado, the tailor, put a sign in his shop door, back in 5 minutes, and went home for the day. The pines waved slowly and voluptuously. The hens in 100 hen yards complained in placid voices of their evil lot. Pilon and Pablo sat under a pink rose of Castile in Torrelli's yard and quietly drank wine and let the afternoon grow on them as gradually as hair grows. "It is just as well that we do not take 2 gallons of wine to Danny," said Pilon. "He is a man who knows little restraint in drinking." Pablo agreed. "Danny looks healthy," he said, "but it is just such people that you hear of dying every day. Look at Rudolfo Kelling. Look at Angelina Vasquez." Pilon's realism arose mildly to the surface. "Rudolfo fell into the quarry above Pacific Grove," he observed in mild reproof. "Angelina ate a bad can of fish, but," he continued kindly, "I know what you mean, and there are plenty of people who died through abuse of wine." All Monterey began to make gradual instinctive preparations against the night. Mrs. Gutierrez cut little chiles in her enchilada sauce. Rupert Hogan, the seller of spirits, added water to his gin and put it away to be served after midnight. And he shook a little pepper into his early evening whiskey. At El Paseo Dancing Pavilion, Bullet Rosendale opened a carton of pretzels and arranged them like coarse brown lace on the big courtesy plates. The Palace Drug Company wound up its awnings. A little group of men who had spent the afternoon in front of the post office greeting their friends moved toward the station to see the Del Monte Express from San Francisco come in. The seagulls arose glutted from the fish cannery beaches and flew toward the sea rocks. Lines of pelicans pounded doggedly over the water wherever they go to spend the night. On the Persine fishing boats, the Italian men folded their nets over the big rollers. Little Miss Alma Alvarez, who was 90 years old, took her daily bouquet of pink geraniums to the Virgin on the outer wall of the Church of San Carlos. In the neighboring and Methodist village of Pacific Grove, the WCTU met for tea and discussion, listened while a little lady described the vice and prostitution of Monterey with energy and color. She thought a committee should visit these resorts to see exactly how terrible conditions really were. They had gone over the situation so often, and they needed new facts. The sun went westering and took on an orange blush. Under the rosebush in Torrelli's yard, Pablo and Pilon finished the first gallon of wine. Torrelli came out of his house and passed out of the yard without seeing his erstwhile customers. They waited until he was out of sight on the way to Monterey, whereupon Pablo and Pilon went into the house and, with a conscious knowledge of their art, cozened their supper out of Mrs. Torrelli. They slapped her on the buttocks and called her a butter duck and took little courteous liberties with her person, and finally left her flattered and slightly tousled. Means they had sex with her? And took little courteous liberties with their person. Now it was evening in Monterey and the lights went on. The windows glowed softly. The Monterey Theater began to spell, "Children of Hell, Children of Hell," over and over with its lights. A small but fanatic group of men who believed that the fish bite in the evening took their places on the cold sea rocks. A little fog drifted through the streets and hung about the chimneys, and a fine smell of burning pine wood filled the air. Pablo and Pilon went back to the rosebush and sat on the ground, but they were not as contented as they had been. "It is cool here," said Pilon, and he took a drink of wine to warm himself. "We should go to our own house where it is warm," said Pablo. "But there is no wood for the stove." "Well," said Pablo, "if you take the wine, I will meet you at the corner of the street." And he did in about half an hour. Pilon waited patiently, for he knew there are some things even one's friends cannot help with. While they waited, Pilon kept a watchful eye aimed down the street in the direction Torrelli had taken, for Torrelli was a forceful man to whom explanations, no matter how carefully considered or how beautifully phrased, were as chaff. Moreover, Torelli had, Pelone knew, the Italians' exaggerated and wholly quixotic ideal of marital relations, but Pelone watched in vain. No, Torelli came brutally home. In a little while, Pablo joined him, and Pelone noticed with admiration and satisfaction that he carried an armful of pine sticks from Torelli's woodpile. Pablo made no comment on his recent adventure until they arrived at their house. Then he echoed Danny's words, "A lively one, that butterduck." Pelone nodded his head in the dark and spoke with a quiet philosophy. "It is seldom that one finds all things at one market, wine, food, love, and firewood. We must remember Torelli, Pablo. My friend, there is a man to know. We must take him a little present sometime." Pelone built a roaring fire in the cast-iron stove. The two friends drew their chairs close and held their fruit jars to the heat to warm the wine a little. This night the light was holy, for Pablo had bought a candle to burn for San Francisco. Something had distracted his attention before that sacred plan had consummated. Now the little wax taper burned beautifully in an abalone shell, and it threw the shadows of Pablo and Pelone on the wall and made them dance. "I wonder where that Jesus Maria has gone," Pelone observed. "He promised he would come back long ago," said Pablo. "I do not know whether that is a man to trust or not. Perhaps some little thing happened to detain him, Pablo. Jesus Maria, with that red beard and that kind of heart, is nearly always in some kind of trouble with ladies." "He is a grasshopper brain," said Pablo. "He sings and plays and jumps. There was no seriousness in him." They had no great time to wait. They had barely started their second fruit jar of wine when Jesus Maria staggered in. He held each side of the door to steady himself. His shirt was torn and his face was bloody. One eye showed dark and ominous in the dancing candlelight. Pablo and Pelone rushed to him. "Our friend, he is hurt. He has fallen from a cliff. He has been run over by a train." There was not the slightest tone of satire, but Jesus Maria knew it for the most deadly kind of satire. He glared at them out of the eye which still had some volition in such matters. "Both thy mothers were udderless cows," he remarked. They fell back from him in horror at the vulgarity of the curse. "Our friend is wandering in his mind. The bone of his head has been broken. Pour him a little wine, Pablo." Jesus Maria sat morosely by the fire and caressed his fruit jar, while his friends waited patiently for an explanation of the tragedy. But Jesus Maria seemed content to leave his friends in ignorance of the mishap. Although Pelone cleared his throat several times, and although Pablo looked at Jesus Maria with eyes which offered sympathy and understanding, Jesus Maria sat sullenly and glared at the stove and at the wine and at the blessed candle, until at length his discourteousness, reticence, drove Pelone to an equal discourtesy. Afterwards, he did not see how he could have done it. "Those soldiers again?" he asked. "Yes," Jesus Maria growled. "This time they came too soon. There must have been 20 of them to have used thee so," Pablo observed for the good of his friend's spirit. "Everyone knows thou art a bad man in a fight," and Jesus Maria did look a little happier then. "They were 4, he said. Arabella Gross helped, too. She hit me on the head with a rock." Pelone felt a wave of moral resentment rising within him. "I will not remind thee," he said severely, "how thy friends warned thee against this cannery slob." He wondered whether he had warned Jesus Maria and seemed to remember that he had. "These cheap white girls are vicious, my friend," Pablo broke in. "But did you give her that little thing that goes around?" Jesus Maria reached into his pocket and brought out a crumpled pink rayon brassiere. "The time had not come," he said. "I was just getting to that point, and besides, we had not come into the woods yet." Pelone sniffed the air and shook his head, but not without a certain sad tolerance. "Thou hast been drinking whiskey." Jesus Maria nodded. "Where did this whiskey come from?" "From those soldiers," said Jesus Maria. "They had it under a culvert. Arabella knew it was there. She told me, but those soldiers saw us with the bottle." The story was gradually taking shape. Pelone liked it this way. It ruined the story to have it all come out quickly. The good story lay in half-told things, which must be filled in out of the hearer's own experience. He took the pink brassiere from Jesus Maria's lap and ran his fingers over it, and his eyes went to musing. But in a moment they shone with a joyous light. "I know," he cried. "We'll give this thing to Danny as a gift to Mrs. Morales." Everyone except Jesus Maria applauded the idea, and he found himself hopelessly outnumbered. Pablo, with a delicate understanding of the defeat, filled up Jesus Maria's fruit jar. When a little time had passed, all 3 men began to smile. Pelone told a very funny story of a thing that happened to his father. Good spirits returned to the company. They sang. Jesus Maria did a shuffling dance to prove he was not badly hurt. The wine went down and down in the jug, but before it was gone, the 3 friends grew sleepy. Pelone and Pablo staggered off to bed, and Jesus Maria lay comfortably on the floor beside the stove. The fire died down. The house was filled with the deep sounds of slumber. In the front room, only one thing moved. The blessed candle darted its little spear-pointed flame up and down with incredible rapidity. Later, this little candle gave Pelone and Pablo and Jesus Maria some ethical things to think about. Simple small rod of wax with a string through it, such a thing you would say is answerable to certain physical laws, and to none other. Its conduct, you would think, was guaranteed by certain principles of heat and combustion. You light the wick, the wax is caught and drawn up the wick, the candle burns a number of hours, goes out, and that is all. The incident is finished. In a little while, the candle was forgotten, and then, of course, it has never existed. Have you forgotten that this candle was blessed, that in a moment of conscious or perhaps pure religious exaltation, it was designed by Pablo for San Francisco? Here was a principle which takes the wax and rod outside the jurisdiction of physics. The candle aimed its spirit of light at heaven like an artist who consumes himself to become divine. The candle grew shorter and shorter. A wind sprang up outside and sifted through the cracks in the wall. The candle sagged sideways, a silken calendar, bearing the face of a lovely girl looking out of the heart of an American beauty rose, floated out a little distance from the wall. It came into the spear of flame. The fire licked up the silk and raised toward the ceiling. A loose piece of wallpaper caught fire and fell flaming into a bundle of newspapers. In the sky, saints and martyrs looked on with set and unforgiving faces. The candle was blessed. It belonged to St. Francis. St. Francis will have a big candle in its place tonight. If it were possible to judge depth of sleep, it could be said with justice that Pablo, whose culpable action was responsible for the fire, slept even more soundly than his two friends. But since there was no gauge, it can only be said that he slept very, very soundly. The flames ran up the walls and found little holes in the roof and leaked through into the night. The house filled with the roar of fire. Jesus Maria turned over uneasily and began in his sleep to take off his coat. Then a flaming shingle dropped in his face. He leaped up with a cry and stood shocked at the fire that raged about. "Pilon!" he shrieked. "Pablo!" He ran into the other room, pulled his friends out of bed, and pushed them out of the house. Pilon still grasped the pink brassiere in his fingers. They stood outside the burning house and looked in the open fire curtained door. They could see the jug standing on the table with a good 2 inches of wine in it. Pilon sensed the savage, incipient heroism of Jesus Maria. "Do not do it," he shouted. "It must be lost in the fire as a punishment on us for leaving it." The cry of sirens came to them and the roar of trucks climbing the hill in second gear from the firehouse in Monterey. The big red fire vehicles drew near and their searchlights played among the pine trunks. Pilon turned hastily to Jesus Maria. "Run and tell Danny his house is burning. Run quickly, Jesus Maria." "Why don't you go?" "Listen," said Pilon. "Danny does not know you are one who rents his house. He may be a little bit angry with Pablo and me." Jesus Maria grasped his logic and raced towards Danny's house. The house was dark. "Danny," Jesus Maria cried. "Danny, your house is on fire." There was no answer. "Danny," he cried again. A window went up in Mrs. Morales' house next door. Danny sounded irritable. "What the hell do you want? Your other house is on fire, the one Pablo and Pilon live in." For a moment, Danny did not answer. Then he demanded, "Is the fire department there?" "Yes," cried Jesus Maria. The whole sky was lighted up by now. The crackling of burning timbers could be heard. "Well," said Danny, "if the fire department can't do anything about it, what does Pilon expect me to do?" Jesus Maria heard the window bang shut, and he turned and trotted back toward the fire. It was a bad time to call Danny, he knew, but then how could one tell? If Danny had missed the fire, he might have been angry. Jesus Maria was glad he had told him about it anyway. Now the responsibility lay on Mrs. Morales. It was a little house. There was plenty of draft. The walls were perfectly dry. Perhaps not since old Chinatown had burned had there been such a quick and thorough fire. The men of the fire department took a look at the blazing walls and then began wetting the brush and the trees in the neighboring houses. In less than an hour, the house was completely gone. Only then did the hoses play on the heap of ashes to put out the coals and the sparks. Pilon and Pablo and Jesus Maria stood shoulder to shoulder and watched the whole thing. Half the population of Monterey and all the population of Tortilla Flat, except Danny and Miss Morales, stood happily about and watched the fire. At last, when it was all over, when only a cloud of steam arose from the black heap, Pilon turned silently away. "Where goest thou?" Pablo called. "I go," said Pilon, "to the woods to have out my sleep. I counsel you to come too. It will be well if Danny does not see us for a little while." They nodded gravely and followed him into the pine forest. "It is a lesson to us," said Pilon. "By this we learn never to leave wine in a house overnight." "Next time," Pablo said hopelessly, "you will take it outside and someone will steal it." These guys are idiots.